Okay, world history. Welcome back. Hope everybody had a good weekend. Hope you guys are all finding a rhythm with this online learning. I think I am. Miss you guys, of course, but overall, we're doing a really good job of getting our work in, and you guys are holding up your end of the bargain so far. So, since we're not in class together, I won't ask you to write down anything right now, but if I asked you to write down what you know about World War One, I'm curious what you would say. I think some people would probably say trench warfare. Um, Other people might say Franz Ferdinand. That's a name that seems to stick with people just from a trivia point of view. But we're going to explore the outbreak or the causes for it. B, what the realities of the war actually look like. And that's when we're going to talk about the trenches and machine guns and poison gas, etc. And then C, what were the after effects? What were the results globally um, of the war? All right. So you can follow along with the notes if you want to. Um, by 1914, Europe had enjoyed a century of relative peace with one another for nearly 30 years. Many idealists hoped for a permanent end to the scourge of war. Some Europeans believed that progress had made war a thing of the past, yet, in a little more than a decade, a massive war would engulf Europe and spread across the globe. While peace and harmony characterized much of Europe at the beginning of the 1900s, there were less visible and darker forces at work as well. Below the surface of peace and goodwill, Europe witnessed several gradual developments that would ultimately help propel the continent into war. Now, as far as the main causes, I love it because personally, as a student, I love when there is an acronym. And there is in this case. When we're talking about the main causes of war, that's MAIN. Couldn't be easier. The M in main for main causes stands for militarism or building up of your armed forces. So the 1800s, which we just talked about, the age of empires and revolutions, they saw a rise in militarism. Militarism, or this building up or glorification of the military. The nations of Europe believed that to be truly great, they needed to have a powerful military. And that's true to some extent. By 1914, all the great powers except Britain had large standing armies. Britain still had a strong navy, but their army wasn't particularly strong or large. In addition, military experts stressed the importance of being able to quickly mobilize or organize and move troops in case of a war. Generals in each country developed highly detailed plans for such mobilization. With each country's rise in military power, others would raise theirs. The result was an arms race that further increased suspicions and made war more likely. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase keeping up with the Joneses, and that refers to people's desire to have the same things or as good at things or better things as their peers. The idea being, you live next door to the Joneses, they get a fancy car, you want a fancy car. Well, that same concept is at play in terms of this militarism. There are these countries, even in times of peace, they realize that at the end of the day, they are competitors. Any country that had any aspirations of establishing a global empire is, in one way or another, a competitor with the other. So, It just makes sense that as one power would be building up their military, the other power would be looking across saying, well, I'm not sure what's going on, but if it makes sense for them to build it up, it makes sense for us to build it up as well. The greatest competition was the Navy rivalry between Britain and Germany. To protect its huge overseas empire, Britain had built the world's most respected navy. As Germany began acquiring overseas colonies, it began to build up its own navy. Suspicion of Germany's motives, Suspicious of Germany's motives, Britain in turn increased naval spending. Right, so Great Britain, it's a relatively small nation, and it's surrounded by water. Great Britain's power wasn't necessarily in the real estate that comprised Great Britain proper. It was in all their land holdings all over the world. So it wasn't as necessary that they have this immense army. The reality was that it made more sense for them to build up their navy. And they start to see Germany doing the same thing, and they're not sure what's going on, but they don't like it. The A, alliances. Alliances or agreements or promises to defend and help another country. There are two main alliances leading into World War One. The Triple Alliance, or Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the bad guys, and the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. Eventually, we'll join with them, but in the beginning, as the war was as they were setting the stage for the war, those were the two main alliances. Well, why did they feel the need to establish alliances in the first place? That same distrust that caused them to build up their militaries, is going to cause them to establish alliances with other countries. So distrust led the great powers to sign treaties pledging to defend one another. These alliances were intended to create powerful combinations that no one would dare attack. Gradually, two huge alliances emerged. This alliance system had been designed to keep peace in Europe, but it would instead help push the continent into war. So when it says create powerful combinations that no one would dare attack, the idea is that other countries, for example, Germany, which was a rival of Britain, okay, maybe Germany wouldn't be opposed to attacking Britain if it was just Britain. But because Britain has aligned themselves with France and Russia, now Germany faces the prospect of, okay, if we attack Britain, we now have to confront France and Russia as well. So these alliances were meant to be a deterrent or something that prevented war, but they had the opposite effect ultimately. First of these two alliances was the Triple Alliance, and it had its origins in Bismarck's days. He knew that France longed to avenge its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Surely that France would not attack Germany without help. Bismarck signed treaties with other powers. In 1882, he formed the Triple Alliance with Italy and Austria-Hungary. In 1914, when the war erupted, Germany and Austria-Hungary fought on the same side. They became known as the Central Powers. The Triple Entente. A rival bloc took shape in 1894 when France and Russia formed an alliance. In 1904, France and Britain signed an entente, a non-binding agreement to follow common policies. Though not as formal as a treaty, the Entente led to close military and diplomatic ties. Britain later signed a similar agreement with Russia. When war began, these powers became known as the Allies. Now, we've talked a couple of times, or I guess not in this class, we talked about it in U.S. history, where we also studied World War One and are about to get into World War Two. And that is that Russia in both world wars was a friend to the U.S. But Great Britain, France, and the United States, they weren't necessarily that fond of Russia. Russia just happened to be to the eastern side of Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And Russia had a colossal population, and their leaders weren't so opposed to letting their citizens die, letting them starve or otherwise suffer. So they were able to use these. Well, we'll get into that later. But my point is, even though it was a sort of a frenemies situation, the Russian partnership was very significant. So M, militarism, A, alliances, I, imperialism. Imperialism, I know it's spelled with an I, but just think of the main word. It's trying to build up an empire. So from 1910 to 1914, all these countries are increasing defense expenditures. In other words, spending more money on their army and navy. France increases by 10%, Britain by 13, Russia by 39, and Germany by 73%. So in terms of forming these alliances, if we're going back to the previous cause, you can see if you're France, Britain, and Russia, and you're looking at your old buddy Germany, and Germany has increased their military spending by 73%, you're going to be a little bit suspicious of that. And you're going to want to take measures. So, as we have already learned, the nations of Europe competed fiercely for colonies in Africa and Asia. The quest for colonies sometimes pushed European nations to the brink of war. As European countries continued to compete for overseas empires, their sense of rivalry and mistrust of one another deepened. Imperialism caused friction between the countries of Europe. Imperialism would also mean that a war between countries in Europe would spread to their colonies around the world. Do you guys get that? In other words, since Great Britain, Germany, France, Russia all had colonies outside of their actual countries, that meant that if the actual countries, if Great Britain and Germany's proper went to war, that suddenly they would be fighting all their little colonies. So just this, when you look back, I can't help but find it really interesting as a history teacher. When you look back, it's hindsight is 2020, but you're watching this slow motion train wreck of all these things just coming together to explode. Imperialism means basically when war would break out, these other rival colonies in Africa and other places would be fighting for which country had the greatest increase. Germany by a mile. So we've talked militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Nationalism, or having pride in your country, being willing to defend it. Now, when I think of having pride in your country, I really think of the word patriotism more than anything. Nationalism, when that's used academically or in the news, if you hear things referred to as nationalistic, often that word is being used in a derogatory um, way. So for the purposes of this class, when we hear nationalism, let's think sort of excessive patriotism, being almost aggressively patriotic, similar to jingoism, but maybe not quite as severe. So the rise of nationalism. Another main cause was the growth of nationalism, or a deep devotion to one's nation. Nationalism can be a unifying force within a country. However, it can also cause intense competition among nations, with each seeking to overpower the other. Think of the violence that breaks out between fans of football teams. I don't know if you guys have seen those. Excuse me. Those stadium fights. The intense pride in their teams sometimes cause them to do harm on opposing fans. Nationalism is the intense pride of citizens rather than fans. By the turn of the 20th century, a fierce rivalry indeed had developed among Europe's great powers. Those nations were Germany, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, and France. Germans were proud of their new empire's military power and industrial leadership. France, who had taken a back seat really to England, they wanted their place at the head of the table again. They wanted to once again be the top power in Europe. So we've officially gone through the main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Those are the things that set the stage. But the thing that finally made it blow up once and for all, what they call the spark that ignited the powder keg in the Balkans, was the assassination of this guy. All right. What finally got this going were these two guys, specifically the one on the left. His name was Gavrilo Princip, and he was a member of a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand. Pretty cool name for an organization. But and I'll show you on the map. So here's Austria-Hungary. Here's Serbia down here. So Sarajevo down here at the bottom of Austria-Hungary. Serbia, you can see borders Austria-Hungary. So when I say he was a Serbian nationalist, I mean he wanted Serbia to be out from under Austro-Hungarian control. This is a fellow named Franz Ferdinand. So Gavrilo Princip assassinating Franz Ferdinand, they call that the spark that ignited the powder keg in the Balkans. His wife was also assassinated. It's very interesting. He married a non-noble. So after she died, she was not allowed to get the same type of funeral as her husband. And in fact, when they set the caskets up next to each other, they lowered her casket about a foot lower than his, just as a sign that basically he was the boss. So interesting stuff. But because of this 4 reasons, by June of 1914, Europe was tense. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife drove through the Bosnian city of Sarajevo. Acting on a Black Hand plan, Gavrilo Princip shot them. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the murders. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Alliances came into play. Remember, because Austria-Hungary had allies and because Serbia had allies, um, Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia was basically them lighting the fuse for the World War. Because Russia specifically, they were an ally of Serbia. So Austria-Hungary attacks Serbia. Russia gets Serbia's back because Serbia by itself couldn't defeat Austria-Hungary. No way about it. So, and Russia sends troops to the Austrian border. France, remember, who's allied with Russia, they get in as well because they're helping out their allies. Germany then goes on the attack towards France, and to get there, they first attack Belgium. And then Britain, who was an ally of Belgium, declares war on Germany. So again, it happens almost immediately, and that's why they call it the spark that ignited the powder keg. Let's see if this will let us copy and paste. That would be terrific. That's all right. So there you go. Austria-Hungary blames Serbia, declares war on Serbia. Russia declares war on them. Germany declares war on them. It's just it's dominoes. I don't know if you guys have ever played with dominoes, but the idea basically is that after the first one goes down, they're all going down. So this might not let us play the video that's embedded. There's a short video, but it might. And if it does, we're going to watch it. There you go. 2 minutes, 16 seconds.
June 28th, 1914, in Sarajevo, the capital of Serbia. 2 bullets, fired by an angry Serbian nationalist, kill Archduke Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His murder destabilized an already tense Europe and sparked the First World War. Conflict had built for the past 50 years as many European powers claimed new colonies and beefed up their militaries. Everyone wanted more land, resources, and power.
The British had an empire, the French had an empire, the Germans had and wanted an empire. And as these empires collided, it created great friction.
But Germany wasn't alone in the empire-building business. Nationalism was rampant in the European countries. To protect their interest and gain even more strength, these empires sought allies.
Starting at the beginning of the 20th century, the various powers of Europe began forming alliance systems. The British and the French allied against the Germans and eventually drew in the Russians. The Germans felt they needed help, so they allied with the Austrians. And then they eventually attached to the Ottoman Empire. So that by 1914, Europe had become an armed camp. Britain, France, Russia on one side. These are going to become the Allied powers. And Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on the other side. These will be the Central Powers. By 1914, the alliance systems had been built in such a way that the slightest tremor could cause the whole structure to collapse.
And collapse it did. After the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, a Serbian ally, then declared war on Austria-Hungary. The complicated web of alliances went into overdrive. England and France jumped in to protect Serbia, and Germany was more than willing to fight for Austria-Hungary. The U.S. joined the Allied powers in 1917, and by the end, over 100 countries participated, even ones as far away as Japan and Bolivia. The Great War finally ended in 1918.
All right. Let's keep going, shall we? We're not going to watch that one. That's 23 minutes long, but got about 4 minutes left, so we won't get all of this done, but we'll go ahead and start on this. So by now, you guys should know when I asked what the spark was that started World War One, you would tell me that it was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, a guy named Franz Ferdinand. He was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip from a terrorist organization called the Black Hand. They called it the Great War or the War to End All Wars. There was, they sincerely thought that this would be the last one. This was such a colossal undertaking that there's simply no way there could ever be another war that would match it. Of course, that wound up not being the case. With that, let's go into our classwork page. That's government. So let's check out world history. Classwork, week 3, day 1 analysis questions. Let's see. Why don't we say list and define the 4 main causes of World War One. And guys, make sure that you are defining it. That's important. So, list and define the 4 main causes of World War One. 1, 2, oh, there we go. So, keep up the good work. Each student gets a copy. And I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Hope everybody's doing well and staying safe. Be nice to your siblings. Don't drive your parents crazy. We'll check in with you tomorrow.